the winds around our lives and the lives of so many others for whom we also care. May we be mindful always of the interconnection of all of us and all things, all existence. May we draw strength from that. May we draw comfort from that. May we also draw the courage to go from this community and to do the things that we need to do to move all of us, all of existence, more closely toward the world in which we long to live. Blessed be. May it be so. May we be so. In a moment, the ushers will come among us with the offering bowls. You may choose to give online. If you're in the sanctuary, you can find directions in the order of service. If you're joining us online, you can find online donation instructions out on our website, thefun, thefun.org. We do, as you may be aware, every month share a portion of our collections with an organization that shares our values and works to further them in the world beyond this congregation. This month's recipient for Share the Plate is Project Return. And you can read more about them. They work with people returning to the community after incarceration. You can read more in your order of service. As always, your contributions, like your presence here with us, are received with gratitude.
This morning's reading comes from a book called Figuring by Maria Popova. You may know her website, Brain Pickings. Some truths, like beauty, are best illuminated by the sidewise gleam of figuring, of meaning-making. In the course of our figuring, orbits intersect, often unbeknownst to the bodies they carry. Intersections mappable only from the distance of decades or centuries. Facts crosshatch with other facts to shade in the nuances of a larger truth. Not relativism, no, but the mightiest realism we have. We slice through the simultaneity by being everything at once. Our first names and our last names, our loneliness and our society, our bold ambition and our blind hope, our unrequited and part requited loves. Lives are lived in parallel and perpendicular, fathomed non-linearly, figured not in the straight graphs of biography, but in many-sided, many-splendored diagrams. Lives interweave with other lives, and out of the tapestry arise hints at answers to questions that raise to the bone of life. What are the building blocks of character, of contentment, of lasting achievement? How does a person come into self-possession and sovereignty of mind against the tide of convention and unreasoning collectivism? Does genius suffice for happiness? Does distinction? Does love?
Please rise in body or in spirit as you're so moved and join in singing number 194, Faith is a Forest, hymn number 194.
Couple small notes on the poetry reading. First is that the argument he's having in this poem is with something that's known as post-structuralism, which we won't get into right now because that would take about 7 years. But basically arguing with the notion that because there's no inherent connection between the noises we make and the things that those noises represent, that things can't necessarily be as true as we want them to be. Second is there's a slight typo in the order of service. It's actually Robert Hass, not Robert. You've heard of the silent T. This is an invisible T. Okay. Meditation at Lagunitas. All the new thinking is about loss. In this, it resembles all the old thinking. The idea, for example, that each particular erases the luminous clarity of a general idea. That the clown-faced woodpecker probing the dead sculpted trunk of that black birch is, by his presence, some tragic falling off from a first world of undivided light. Or the other notion that, because there is in this world no one thing to which the bramble of blackberry corresponds, a word is elegy to what it signifies. We talked about it late last night, and in the voice of my friend, there was a thin wire of grief, a tone almost querulous. After a while, I understood that talking this way, everything dissolves. Justice, pine, hair, woman, you, and I. There was a woman I made love to, and I remembered how, holding her small shoulders in my hands sometimes, I felt a violent wonder at her presence, like a thirst for salt, from my childhood river with its island willows. Silly music from the pleasure boat. Muddy places where we caught the little orange silverfish, called pumpkin seed. It hardly had to do with her. Longing, we say, because desire is full of endless distances. I must have been the same to her. But I remember so much, the way her hands dismantled bread, the thing her father said that hurt her, what she dreamed. There are moments when the body is as numinous as words, days that are the good flesh continuing. Such tenderness, those afternoons and evenings, saying blackberry, blackberry, blackberry.
Well, as Unitarian Universalists, we covenant and through the Unitarian Universalist Association to affirm and promote the free and responsible search for truth and meaning. So what in the world does that mean? Really? What is truth? I mean, let's tell the truth. A lot of ink has been spilled on that question. What is truth? Some people think there's just one truth, some platonic one truth that's up there in heaven that's separated from our world. Some people think that we can search for that truth like the Holy Grail and find it. Some people think truth is very black and white. Some truths are very clear, and some truths are very obviously not true. Some people think it's much more complicated than that when we talk about these tangled, interdependent webs of all that is in the world that could be true. It's as wild as the wild blackberries bushes growing all like a big mess out in the woods. So many of you have had talks about this, learned about this through philosophy or theology or scientific theories. I had the opportunity to really delve into this question of what is the truth, studying anthropology. And my favorite class that I ever had in my whole life was called Magic, Science, Religion, and the Question of Rationality. It was taught by the head of the Department of Anthropology at Harvard when I was there like 35 years ago, Stanley Tambaya. And we had a big argument in our section, the small group, because it was a big lecture class, the whole semester over whether you could know the truth or not. Because I'll give you a little history of the field of anthropology. Yes, it was started in Victorian times by, please forgive me, but basically a bunch of old white men from England and then throughout Europe and America who lived a pretty sheltered life in many ways. They had a very narrow cultural experience, and they were going off to different parts in the world to explore how other people lived. And they knew the truth. They were sure. They had figured out everything there was to know about humankind and wrote all kinds of books about it. And then what happened after a few generations is that the people in the places that they were studying, and this is, simplifying all of the ink that's been spilled on this, but those people started to be educated like Dr. Tambaya, who was from Sri Lanka, in Western languages and in Western disciplines. And they said, wait a minute, that's not my culture. You're not talking about us. I'll give you an example. Since these people would just come in once in a while, over, just maybe a decade or two, they assumed and this came from an assumption that these were primitive people and that somehow they were just like their culture had been a long, long time ago, so they called it primitive, and that they had never changed. Somehow that for whatever reasons, they had never changed, and sometimes they were pretty demeaning reasons that they had. And so when some of the local people and this was in, and I really can't remember, I couldn't find it, it was in the South Pacific, and the people there were doing one of their rituals that they did, and somebody within the tribe filmed it. And you could see that they had updated the ritual because one of the leaders of the ritual had made this big kind of funny wooden camera and was kind of dancing around and worked into the ritual of going and pretend filming the people who were watching it. and making a comment. So it was obviously a reaction to changes that had happened over time. And for some reason, this was in the very early, like 1920s, this rocked anthropology because people started to realize, okay, we have gone in with our own subjective, culturally shaped assumptions, and that's true. That I think that's a true thing, that we are all enculturated. So the argument was, you cannot know, all of a sudden they started arguing, you cannot know the truth because people are nothing but enculturated beings. We are so shaped by our culture that there's nothing else there. Our language, as Steve was in the poem, there's nothing there but the language, but what you have been taught. And so therefore, and I think it was because these guys had either or thinking. They were very dualistic. So if we made a subjective mistake looking at objective reality, then there must be no objective reality. I mean, I think that's what they were thinking. But that's just my interpretation, not just mine. Other people wrote that. But anyway, we argued about this because our TA was pretty sure there was no there. You know, he says, our culture is sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and that's not their culture, and so we project. And I'm like a young mother, and I'm like, well, there's sex, and there's birth, and there's death, and, we might have some, yes, I know we interpret all those things differently, but we might have some actual physical human points of connection that we could then, figure out what was true from. In other words, there were some truths that might be universal. Just to say that, there are some truths that might be universal. Oh, that was like death, to say that. Okay, so Stanley Timbayo had been educated at Oxford. He was just he unrolled his argument. He never said anything personal until the very last class. So we were all dying to know, what do you think in this argument? He finally came into our section class once, comes in, and we're all like, Professor Timbayo, what do you think? Is there any truths across cultures? I mean, here you are, you grew up in one culture, you were educated in another, you're teaching in yet another culture, you've done field work all over the world in all kinds of cultures. What do you think? He stands there very quietly and goes, every culture I have visited or studied, no matter what their language is, no matter what their culture is, if I hold out my hands like this and bring it to my lips, they go and get me water. I was like, thank God. Okay. There is truth. But it is complicated, right? So the Popova book, Figuring, what she does is she takes people's writings from Maria Mitchell, who was a woman astronomer who discovered comets and stuff, first person to teach astronomy in this country in the mid-1800s, through to Rachel Carson's, the scientist writer who wrote about the ocean and then wrote the book Silent String that as many people feel started the environmental movement. But what she does with this is she reads their science work and their diaries. And she starts connecting them to all of their relationships, who are other scientists, who are other authors, all kinds of writers, nonfiction, fiction, poetry, and going into their lives, weaving together both that subjective and that objective. The subjective, this is how I feel about birth, raising children, sex, and death, along with the objective things that we can observe through all these different sciences. And she weaves that together. So there's a connection of thought, both subjective and objective, both scientific and artistic, from one of those people, from Maria Mitchell all the way to Rachel Carson's, who was a consummate writer of both. It's men and women, but there's a lot of, in the thread, about people living, falling in love with people, having significant relationships that had no frame in their society, be they in love with, women having passionate relationships, or men having passionate relationships with each other. Things that people who were very, not very, that we would call queer now, for instance. So all these people, you can tease all of that out as they're struggling of how to live who they are in their culture. She definitely is inviting us all to see truth is something that you do have to seek over time and in relationship. In other words, if you're only hanging out with people that think just like you, you are not seeking the truth. Now, one of the things that she talks about in her book is how different scientific technologies really help people see the truth in new ways. And the two that she talks a lot about are the people who invented, and then the other people who used photography and the advances in the telescope, that they become threads throughout. Technology has always shaped the truth. And so, like, when I went to school, and you went to school, you probably learned research skills, and it was all about books then. How do we research? How do we find out what's true? And we know now that technology has changed. That we live in, the so-called information age, the electronic age, where, and it's amazing. You can go on and, we're not allowed to say Google in my house because my son works for Yahoo, but, do a search on something, and all of a sudden there's all of this information that may be conflicting, right? But it's all there at a fingertip. So what we are learning is that we have to learn a whole new way to responsibly search for the truth. So Steve here, he's always seeking to understand how that electronic world works to make judgments. And he's edited and written, putting together nonfiction and people writing about the arts, and so he wants to know how all that works. It's a whole new research. So we all know now that the algorithms that help the things that go onto our phone, which are just mathematical formulas that if you keep pressing one thing, it helps guide you to other things like it. And what that's done, it's helped separate people with different interests all over the world. So we just learned how Russia has used that very intelligently, quite honestly, to help divide people in America even more during elections. And now they seem to be doing, I was reading in the Times this morning, the New York Times, that they seem to be doing it in Europe with the votes for the euro right now. And so it behooves us to think about how our information gets to us, and how it could be building new walls of separation, new ways to segregate us, so we are not building those rich, complex feedback loops about what is true. Those rich, multi-faceted points of view that help us know larger views, larger truths. And as Popova says, those larger truths slowly accrue over time. In other words, there's some truths we never can get to without decades of being interconnected with many points of view over time. Decades. That is what I would call wisdom. Understanding that you're never done with seeking the truth. And oh, how humbling it is, isn't it? You think you've got an idea of what's true about something, and then you find out, no, I've got to edit that. As I hear what other people are saying about that and their experiences, it really looks different than I thought. Or there's more research on something, and that has really shown that I need to look in a different direction. I'll never forget one of my anthropologist teachers who had worked with women all over the world, and I was all about the great goddess. I worship the great goddess. And she said to me one day, Gail, how is the way you believe and worship any different than the way you were taught to worship God, the omnipotent, omnipresent? And I went, I almost got sick having that challenged. But oh my gosh, it opened up for me more seeking, a way to find a much more nuanced and, quite honestly, for me, enriching, enlivening my spiritual life as I looked at how could I look beyond my cultural conditioning at spirituality and God. So that's just an example for me, but we are constantly and humbly taking in new information, new facts, new truths to make a richer truth, a larger truth, which is wisdom. So, today, I just want to remind us all, as we dedicated our children, for every single one of you, may your mind seek wisdom. May your lips speak truth to one another, and may your hearts know the love that connects you to all kinds of people and animals and truths and beings across this world, that does not segregate you one from the other, so that the work of your bodies can be blessed all the days of your life.
Pull out your insert from your order of service. We'll sing The Star of Truth to the hymn tune, The Gift of Love. Please join in the singing. The star of truth but dimly shines behind the veiling clouds of night, but every searching eye divines some partial glimmer of its light. The certainty for which we
words to the chalice extinguishing are at the bottom of your order of service. Please join me. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.
I'd like to close with the words by Walter Royal Jones. Mindful of truth ever exceeding our knowledge, and community ever exceeding our practice, reverently we covenant together, beginning with ourselves as we are, to share the strength of integrity and the heritage of the Spirit in the unending quest for wisdom and love. The service is over. Let our service begin again, renewed.